Russia Tomorrow.
С нами на прямой связи Марк Галиотти.
We're joined live by Mark Galeotti, an honorary professor at University College London, who is well familiar with the situation in Russia and Ukraine and spends a lot of time dealing with this issue. Thank you for finding the time to join us.
Я надеюсь, что Марк слышит меня, и перевод тоже слышит. Я прежде всего хочу спросить о предстоящем вот этом нападении.
I first wanted to ask you about the impending attack that everyone is predicting. It has essentially become common knowledge that in spring, Russia will launch another second full-scale attack on Ukraine. When discussing this attack, it's often mentioned that they will attempt to capture the capital, Kiev, and install new leadership. And many are also saying that there will be a mobilization of up to 1 million people that Putin is ready to enact to support this effort. What is your perspective on this, Mark?
Well, yes, I think it's inevitable that there will be some kind of spring offensive. If nothing else, this is the opportunity that the Russians need to demonstrate that this war is not going away. Remember, I don't think Putin actually expects to be able to win the war on the battlefield. If he can make victories, that's great. But his real chance of success is that if he can split the West and reduce the level of support they provide Ukraine. Now, in that context, I don't really see the likelihood of an attack on Kyiv. I just don't think that there's any real chance of victory there. Instead, I think we're going to see a continued attempt to basically consolidate positions in the Donbass. But even then, look, there are, maybe 150,000 mobilized reservists ready to be deployed. That's already a fairly substantial force. We may see another wave of mobilizations, but I cannot see any likelihood of the kind of high figures that we've been told. 1 million soldiers. There is no way that Russia could train, equip, and use 1 million soldiers at the moment. Instead, I think if we're going to see more escalation, it's actually going to be conscripts. There are, after all, about 180,000 conscripts, many of them, frankly, better trained and better armed than the mobilized reservists. And in that context, although there's a massive political risk attached to it, if Putin absolutely wants to escalate, then I think it's the conscripts that he'll turn to.
Хорошо. Вы упомянули словосочетание «расколоть Запад», Марк.
You mentioned this idea of fracturing the West. How possible would such a plan really be, given that since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, we have observed, without exaggeration, an unprecedented level of unity between the member states of the EU, the United States, and so on? Or do you see signs of potential issues?
Look, there's no question but that there is a certain degree of quiet Ukraine fatigue, especially in Europe, but also, I think it's fair to say, in the United States. There are some figures who are thinking, look, we're spending a lot of money. Are we really committed to doing this indefinitely? But I do think at the moment it's very much in the sort of the quiet corners of politics. I don't see any sign imminently that there's going to be any break in the unity of the West. And indeed, the recent decision to send tanks in some ways was a reaffirmation of that commitment. But Putin, first of all, he has to believe this. This is his only real chance of victory. He is not going to beat the Ukrainians on the battlefield. And therefore, if he is to salvage any kind of victory, then it has to be through Western division. So Putin believes it because he has to. Also, we should realize that this is basically about turning this into a long war. And we see this, the way that we see that the new rhetoric coming out of the sort of Moscow regime, the way that this is being framed as a counterpart to the Great Patriotic War, the way that all of society and the economy is potentially open to be mobilized and militarized. I mean, these are not the measures you do for a war that's going to last a few more months. These are the measures that you bring about if you think this war is going to run into a matter of years. And again, I think this is really where Putin puts his faith, is that if this war can look as if it's going to run for years, that's when figures in the West may well start to feel discomfort. And this is one of the reasons why the Ukrainians absolutely will want to launch their own offensive to try and demonstrate that, in fact, they can push Russia back, at the very least, to only being able to control Crimea, precisely to show that they're Western backers, that they don't have to worry that they are going to be locked into this conflict forevermore.
Да, и в этом контексте есть ощущение, что
Right. And in this context, there is a sense for Ukraine, as many Ukrainians now realize, that time is very limited and that they must act before the end of 2023, especially considering that the US elections are in 2024, so Washington will be focused on other issues and will not be able to help in such an active capacity. You mentioned the tanks, which, with a great effort and despite the concerns of Mr. Scholz, were delivered to Ukraine. I wanted to also ask you about fighter jets. We can see that the Netherlands are willing to consider the transfer of F-16 aircraft to Ukraine, according to their prime minister. Macron also suggested that he is willing to consider this, joining a number of other nations with a positive outlook on this issue. Joe Biden, however, immediately ruled out sending fighter jets to Ukraine, which was echoed by Boris Pistorius, the new German Federal Minister of Defense. Will Ukraine be able to get those jets?
Someday, potentially, but certainly at the moment, I mean, in part, look, this debate is being driven by the Ukrainians who, as soon as they receive one type of aid, they ask about more. And in part, look, this is a political strategy. It is exactly that they are trying to manage the West. They're trying to keep the West feeling, well, to be blunt, guilty about what it's not supplying, rather than concentrating on what it has supplied. The fact of the matter is, it's really questionable whether at this moment in the war, fighter jets would really make a big difference. Particularly, without going too much into military detail, the F-16 fighter that people are talking about, I mean, that requires long, flat runways of the sort that the Russians could actually hit and blow craters in. Arguably, it wouldn't actually provide a huge advantage to the Ukrainians. And the point is that whereas a tank crew can be trained in a matter of weeks, actually acclimating a fighter pilot to a totally new aircraft and also all the maintenance crew that are needed to keep them operating, I mean, that is a much, much more complex task. So, look, I mean, I think it's, at the moment, it's really not either what Ukraine needs or what the West can provide. But it's a sign, I think, of the way that the debate goes, that as soon as one piece of kit is provided, there are going to be some who are saying, what's next? And in some ways, that has a tendency to distract us from what's really important, which is actually the supply of ammunition. It's all very well providing lots of very high profile and prestigious new equipment systems. But if they haven't got the spare parts, if they haven't got the ammunition that they need, then frankly, these are entirely useless. That's actually where the real Achilles heel of the Ukrainian military effort may turn out to be.
Мгм. Прямо сейчас приходит сообщение со ссылкой на министра иностранных дел Украины, господина
Right
Кулебу.
now, messages are coming in with reference to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Mr. Kuleba, who said that Ukraine is holding active talks to resolve the issue of the transfer of fighter jets and rockets with a radius of 300 kilometers. He emphasized that the fighter jets and long-range rockets would be used reactively and are not weapons of escalation, but weapons of self-defense and aggressor containment. You said that Ukraine is always like this, but to what extent can we judge them, given that they cannot win without weapons? I see that many Western journalists are analyzing the situation like this. Okay, you have weapons to defend yourselves, but not enough to launch a large-scale effective counteroffensive and liberate your territory. It's a stalemate, no?
It's not a stalemate. I think that's actually to underrate the dynamic nature of the battlefield. Look, the Russians are going to launch their spring offensive, probably earlier than later, because they want to essentially make what gains they can precisely before Western tanks and the like can be deployed to the battlefield. And the Ukrainians likewise will be looking to launch an offensive or offensives of their own. And although it's going to be a lot harder now, I mean, there are no more easy victories to be won, particularly under former Joint Commander General Surovikin. The Russians very much consolidated their lines. But still, if the Ukrainians can basically create a mechanized brigade with these Western tanks and all the additional Western armored vehicles, artillery, and so forth that are being provided, they may well have a spearhead which will allow them actually to punch through these lines and make some real gains. So I think at the moment to say that this is becoming a stalemate is premature. We'll have to wait and see. It may well be that the Russians are able to hold their lines and the Ukrainians can't make any substantial headway. And in that case, yes, something will be needed to break the stalemate, or else this could become something that lasts for a long time. But I think that at present, we ought to be careful. We have a tendency to oscillate between one extreme or the other. Outsiders tend to assume that 1 minute the Russians are winning, next minute the Ukrainians are winning, 1 minute it's a stalemate, the next minute it's all to play for. In fact, the reality is that sometimes we just have to wait and see what plays out on the battlefield.
To clarify a little, when do you think the breaking point will come? Will it be in the next few months?
Oh, this is a war that has that has defied predictions. I would say that, I mean, in a way, if the Ukrainians can make genuine headway in their offensive, which is likely to be sort of March, April time, or maybe April, May, depending on how long it takes the tanks to be deployable. Well, if they can make some kind of breakthrough, then I think that they will have momentum. If, on the other hand, they don't, then we're probably in for a long haul.
Mark, the final topic I wanted to discuss with you, which you've written about, is the Russian perspective, the Russian Federation after the war. Can we already talk about it and try to predict what might happen?
Well, again, I think predictions are dangerous, but options are important. I think that what one can say is that, look, I don't know if Putin will survive what I suspect will be a defeat in Ukraine. But on the other hand, I think Putin's system absolutely will not. I mean, we're already seeing, in a way, that the subtleties of Putinism, the attempts at creating the veneer of democracy, all of that is failing. Instead, we are going back to a militarized, increasingly totalitarian society, which is quite reminiscent of late Soviet Union without the ideology. Now, this is not sustainable. This is, you might say, the ideas of a collection of late 60 and early 70-year-old men, products of the Soviet system, who know nothing better. And I think if we look at the political generation that follows, look, I'm not saying that these are in any way Democrats and liberals. They are on the whole opportunists and kleptocrats. But nonetheless, I think from the collapse of Putin's vision for Russia will actually come something different, something that actually provides the opportunities for change. And that's all one can say. I mean, I am still unfashionably optimistic about Russia's trajectory in the very long term. But nonetheless, if you had to ask me what I imagine is going to happen in 5 years' time, I think that we will see basically the increasing decline of the Putinist system and other people trying to basically push something different. And I think from that will come the options for some kind of future democratic trajectory, maybe 10 years from now. I wish I had a more positive prognosis.
Лет через 5, через 10. Это прогноз, который, с одной стороны, кому-то покажется слишком таким действительно пессимистичным, но
5-10 years. That's an outlook that some may find overly pessimistic, but others might currently see Russia as doomed to dictatorship, subjugated to one person in control of everything. Do you think Putin could survive and outlast a defeat in the war?
The question is, what does loss look like? I think that if defeat also means losing Crimea, I think it would be very, very difficult for Putin to actually hold on to power. Mm-hmm. But more to the point, look, even if the war ends tomorrow, even if there's something that he can at least claim as a victory, So long as Putin is in the Kremlin, Russia will remain under sanctions of some kind. The Russian economy will continue to decline. Those companies which left Russia are not likely to return immediately. So, I think that we will see the continuing decay of his system. And unfortunately, yes, it will require his replacement, whether that's from some kind of palace coup or whatever. Very hard it is to think of that. And, it will be definitely something a long way in the future. Or whether it's because he is, after all, he's 70 years old, whether it's he's unable to continue to do the job. But this is it. I think in some ways we have to appreciate the extent to which this is essentially Putin's war. And this is increasingly becoming Putin's Russia. But the point is, after Putin, there will be an opportunity to redefine it. And if Russian history tells us anything, it is, first of all, that actually authoritarianism is not in the national DNA. There is constant resistance to it. But secondly, after periods of particular authoritarianism, inevitably we then get thaws. And that's what I'm looking for. And the question is obviously when the thaw comes and how deep it will be, but it will come.
Что ж, большое вам спасибо, и пусть ваши прогнозы сбудутся. Это Марк Галиотти, почетный профессор.
Thank you very much, and let's hope your predictions come true. That was Mark Galeotti, Honorary Professor at University College London, who joined us live here on TV Rain.
We operated in Russia for 12 years, and the government tried to get rid of us 3 times. They got us on the 6th day of the war in Ukraine.
Мы временно приостанавливаем работу телеканала.
We left Russia, but we kept going. We have now decided to tell the truth about Russia, the war, and Russian society in English as well.
Kherson is Putin's 3rd major defeat in a row.
What is wrong with the Russian army?
Stories no one else can tell you. Hear it right from the source. Subscribe to our channel.